irrigation has been instrumental in really changing the face of agriculture in this region. And of course, it's not just crop production, but even livestock production, and how, irrigation has allowed us to really expand livestock systems across this region. And we've seen that, as I mentioned, with the dairy industry. We can rail in small grains, but we cannot rail in forages. So that's really something that has changed, I would say, the face of agriculture in this region in the last 5 years.
Welcome to the Crop Science Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Arnell. Today, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Jourdan Bell onto the podcast. Jourdan is at Texas A&M. She is an associate professor and agronomist with A&M Agrilife. And I've been honored to at least be able to follow her and her research escapades since she got on staff in 2014. And as far as somebody from the outside looking in, I've always respected everything Jourdan's done. And honestly, anytime I get a chance to collaborate with her, I do it in a heartbeat. So, Jourdan, first, welcome to the Crop Science Podcast. And kind of a follow-up, can you share with the audience a little bit of your background, how you ended up where you're at, and then kind of some of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, no, well, first, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's a great opportunity to visit with you. And, likewise, I enjoy following you, and you do great work, and your work is valuable not just to the producers in Oklahoma, but in the Texas Panhandle as well. So it's just great to visit with you. So I have been with Texas A&M Agrilife since 2014. Before that, though, I actually worked for USDA ARS, and I worked at the research laboratory at Bushland. I worked in dryland cropping systems, did a lot with manure management and irrigation management, and deficit irrigation management, I should say, primarily in wheat sorghum systems. And I decided to go back to school and get my PhD after a while working as a research technician. So I did that. And about the time I was graduating, the position I currently have was open. And of course, my predecessor was Brent Bean, and he really set such a good foundation for this program. Did a lot of the work with forage sorghums and really recognizing that as the region becomes water limited, that's going to be the forage choice for these dry land and limited irrigated acres. I don't think, though, at the time we would have even anticipated the quantity of forage that's demanded in this region because of the expansion of the dairy industry across the whole High Plains, Southern Great Plains region. So I have been in this region and grew up in this region, grew up, my family was in ag. And so I really value working in the High Plains. There are the greatest producers across the Southern Great Plains, Eastern New Mexico, Texas High Plains, Oklahoma. They really understand how to optimize crop production in extreme environments. And increasingly, it's becoming more challenging. Cyclical droughts, as well as rapidly declining groundwater, has really posed a lot of problems for producers.
So, Jourdan, just because this is kind of a wide reach, and I know where you're at because I've been there multiple times, but kind of share a little bit about the environment. I do believe that Southern High Plains environment is a unique one that most outside wouldn't grasp some of the challenges and unique natures of not only the environment, but the soils that we're working with.
Right. So when we talk about the environment, I don't think we can really emphasize the toughness without talking about water. This is, a semi-arid, small grass prairie, native rangelands. But as we have looked at crop productivity in this region, we would not have seen the advances in crop productivity if it hadn't have been for irrigation. And that's because of the rainfall. This area sits in an 18 to 24 inch precipitation zone, with 18 inches being the average annual rainfall in the western Texas Panhandle and 24 inches being the average annual rainfall in the eastern Texas Panhandle. So while, it's a water rainfall limited region, we couple that with an extremely effective environment. It's very windy, low relative humidity. So we have a very high evaporative demand. This region actually sits in a PET zone of 90 inches per year. So when you look at how that drives that crop water demand, there's no way we are going to meet the crop water demand for optimum productivity with rainfall in most years. And so again, back to irrigation. Irrigation has been instrumental in really changing the face of agriculture in this region. And of course, it's not just crop production, but even livestock production, and how irrigation has allowed us to really expand livestock systems across this region. And we've seen that, as I mentioned, with the dairy industry. We can rail in small grains, but we cannot rail in forages. So that's really something that has changed, I would say, the face of agriculture in this region in the last 5 years.
Yeah, I know when I go outside of our area and move maybe into the Corn Belt and do talks, in Indiana and Ohio, one of the aspects that they get blown away by is our peak evaporative demand, the peak PET that you mentioned. It's been a couple moments when we're at, when our corn or forage sorghum's going at full bore, VT and beyond. What kind of evapotranspiration are we seeing, or more so are you seeing on a daily? I think those numbers would shock anybody outside of our region.
Right. So, on average, we talk about when we get to those peak water demand periods, 35 hundredths of an inch per day. But even this year, at our Bushland Research Station, when we were 100 to 105 degrees, we were looking at over 4/10 of an inch per day. And so when you look at the lack of stored soil moisture and the lack of timely in-season precipitation, there goes irrigation. And when producers had the irrigation capacity to, really apply higher water amounts, they could meet that. But today at our lower irrigation capacities, we cannot apply that type of water. And so that's where we really have to reevaluate how we're managing these systems. And so producers are really at a point, a crossroads. Do they continue to irrigate the same irrigated acreage at a reduced rate? Do they concentrate the water? Do they look at alternative cropping choices? How do they manage these systems? And it becomes not just that, but then how do you couple the agronomics with that? And so it's really an interesting period in this region.
So before we go into agronomy, I'll just add that, especially in my region, I'd say it probably translates well into yours, is that historically we had enough well capacity and water capacity where farmers would pre-water winter and early spring, wanting 2 to 4 foot of soil moisture profile. They would build, pause during planting, get the seed up, get whether it's cotton, corn, or otherwise, get that crop up shortly after, then start watering again. And the amazing thing, they don't turn off the pivots. They don't stop. And by black layer, you're at net negative, because basically from about V6 on, you're chasing a losing system because your PET is much greater than any amount of water you can put on. So when it comes into that, now we're talking about the Ogallala Aquifer. We're talking about, loss of well capacity. We have farmers in Oklahoma that are tying, where they once had huge well capacity. Now they're tying 2 or 3 wells together to get enough for one. What are some of the strategies that you and your program have been working in? And forage is one right there. So what are some of the strategies that you're seeing?
Exactly. So forage, do we step back and consider forage production over grain production? And that really does become market driven. For a couple of years, we had extremely high forage prices because of the drought and the forage deficit that we were under. And so producers were able to capitalize on that. Now there's a consequence to that. You have to look at the whole system. But then also, as you mentioned, they're tying wells together. So do we consider, again, do we irrigate the same acreage? Do we deficit irrigate? Do we consider critical growth stage irrigation? Planting dates is another option, though. We've done quite a bit of work looking at alternative planting dates, especially in corn. Historically, producers were planting in April to late April. And then with newer hybrids, we've been able to move that planting date very successfully and maintain the yield potential with an earlier relative maturity corn hybrid to May. And that's been successful probably for the last 20 years. But even with a May planting date, we are looking at that tasseling and silking window being in July. And that is during the hottest part of the summer. So when we talk about these peak ET periods and the water demand, if we cannot meet that water demand, we see silk dehydration, we see reduced kernel set, we see a loss of leaf area because the plant can't, transpirationally cool itself, and it just becomes really impactful. And so shifting the planting date, we see that we can reduce the cumulative water demand, we reduce the heat stress that we would have in July, but then it becomes, okay, what if we run into the risk of an early fall cold front? And so that could potentially reduce kernel set and test weights. And so it's you either balance risk on the front end or there's risk on the back end.
That's fascinating because, I'm listening to the farmers up in the Kansas border also. They're talking about, they were pushing so early. They kept going earlier and earlier. Last couple of years, they've taken a step back because they felt like they went so early. They pushed tasseling during too hot and they had too much pollen issues. So It's interesting to hear that you guys are maybe experiencing the same thing a little bit further south.
It is exactly. And I've worked with producers who have then tried to look at earlier maturing hybrids. Now, we see where a 105-day hybrid does really well in this region. And of course, even if we plant late, those hybrids speed up. And so you might take, a 105-day hybrid and you plant it in mid-June. Now it's going to be a 100-day hybrid. And so you really don't need as many days because the growing degree day accumulation, longer days, and they can be very efficient, but you get too early. And what we run into, there are not early hybrids with the kernel integrity. And so now all of a sudden we have poor kernel integrity, we have ear rots, we potentially set ourselves up for a disaster in that arena and yield losses associated with ear rots. And so it really does become, as we move into these water limited environments, how do we manage all these different factors? And so then there becomes crop selection. Do we continue growing corn when we have limited water, or when do we make the decision to switch to grain sorghum? And producers who have not optimally managed their grain sorghum say, oh, there's not the yield potential. Well, that's because it was not properly managed. We know that when we optimize irrigation, optimize fertility, insect management, everything that we would do for a corn crop, we can achieve these phenomenal sorghum yields, and there's the market for it. Mm-hmm. And so that really becomes a consideration. And then, of course, we've had cotton expand into the northern panhandle and into southwestern Kansas. And so that's really been a good opportunity for producers to take what would be historically acreage that was dedicated to corn and, really stretch that water with a cotton crop. And so that provides another strategy. And cotton, the newer varieties grow extremely well. We can make those higher yield potentials.
Yeah, I was able to pull some 4.5 bale out of Goodwell this year, which
fantastic.
I really didn't think I would get there. I was hoping for 2. So, but it was also, that high plains, the southern high plains, I guess is what you'd say. It's so interesting on the cotton crop is because we're getting to that really short window, right? So I chose a longer cultivar, which really beat out this year because we had a longer fall, which if we'd had one freeze that could have come a few weeks earlier, I would have been down and I would have been picking a bale and a half instead of that 4.5. And
exactly.
It's just such a gamble, which gets into the diversification not of crops, but the cultivars. Some of the stuff, and you mentioned, I'm kind of curious, when you have a conversation with a farmer or a producer, how does it go on selecting the choice of, do I switch crop or percent of fully irrigated? What are the what are the thought processes or the conversations that lead to those decisions?
That's a great question, because I don't know if there's one answer to that. It really depends on a farm by farm consideration. And especially as we have looked at producers switching to cotton, do they have the equipment? Are they willing to either invest in the equipment? Do they want to work with a custom harvester? Those type things. The High Plains as a whole has been set up for grain production. And so that is kind of how I know many producers do step back and weigh those considerations, which are very real considerations. And then, of course, ultimately, and I think it's just human nature, we tend to manage a system with the anticipation this is going to be a good year. All year, El Nino was going to come. It was going to rain this year, and it did, and then it didn't. And so it really does become a little bit of a gamble as well, just because if you don't take a little bit of that risk, there's not the potential for the reward. So it really does become, how do you balance it so that it's not a catastrophe, but yet you can capitalize on good, I think, systems. And so that is where cotton does have the flexibility. I like how you mentioned you planted a little longer of a maturity class. I have seen that. A couple of years ago, I did some work looking at what would be very early maturing cotton, so very determinate, versus what would be a medium long. And what I saw in looking at irrigation timing is that those very early maturing varieties, if we don't have the irrigation early, when we start putting on those squares, they are going to it's not just finishing rapidly at the end, but they're going to transition into reproductive development very quickly, into cutout very quickly, and they're done. Whereas the longer varieties will come back out of cutout, and all of a sudden, we can put on that second crop and capitalize on that. And I do think it becomes important that as producers are making their selections for their cropping system, they're also considering how they're managing the varieties and what variety will give them some flexibility. That's where, as we look at wheat, wheat kind of comes in and out of sometimes popularity with producers. Wheat can use a lot of water. I mean, if we're really going to maximize wheat, it can use a lot of water. It can mine a lot of water out of the soil too, and really deplete that profile. But wheat also truly has 9 lives, like everyone says. I mean, you can look at a wheat crop and write it off, and next thing you know, 4 months later, it made a crop. So, we really see where, especially as we look at concentrating water, and now what do we do with that acreage? We're now having to manage what's going to be dryland or very deficit irrigated acreage. What's going to be a crop we can put there that's going to have the least amount of risk. And so, a low yielding wheat crop is, better than a failed irrigated crop, I think, that had a lot of inputs rather than stretching that water thin. Sorghum, same thing, very flexible.
And plus the value that I see with wheat and our forage sorghums is, one, the narrow row spacing, the ability to have a little bit more residue, a little bit more root anchor. I mean, cotton is a great option once we bring it in, but the post-harvest residual that's left behind, once we get into this high plain environment where the wind really doesn't stop blowing, and the second that we're dry, we start having more soil movement. So, that integration of those. I mean, in the southern plains, we really relied on wheat or a cotton with a cover crop wheat. Katie Lewis does a lot of that stuff. In our Southwest district, we do a lot of that. Almost all cotton acres now have some wheat. But needing something to hold that soil in is always critical.
Exactly.
Looking at, if you want to, what are some of the techniques you might be excited about that may not be adopted just yet, or as early adoption that you see? And maybe it's old techniques, but what are some things that you think are going to be impacting your region for the positive nature in the next 5 to 10 years?
So, that's a really good question.
Well, I just came up with it. So, I just kind of threw that out there. So sorry about that one.
No. It really is. How are we going to, optimize crop production with increasingly more limited water. And it's not just the impact to the farmer. There's this trickle down impact we see as we see, decreases in cotton production, how that's impacting the regeners. We see, as we displace grain, whether it's from corn or sorghum or wheat, and we have more silage, now all of a sudden that's impacting our elevators and that industry. So we have, all these considerations. But really, at the farm level, I can't help but think that as we look at, I guess, a truly integrated system, fertility being one of those components, how do we incorporate technology so that it's profitable? And that's something that I really do step back, because it's amazing to see the technology on equipment, and how that changes the speed of planting, the speed of harvest, the ability to really assess spatial variability across a field with imagery. How are we, though, going to integrate that? And that's something I wish I was, more of a sensor-based person, so that I can say, yeah, I think this is going to change things. But I really do. There's no way, I don't think, that we can stay at the forefront if we are not continuing to consider.
I want to go sideways on this one, because you said something that has actually been in a lot of conversations, especially, Jason Warren, I've worked with for a long time, who is High Plains, works in there as the admin. The conversations when we go outside, these people that are outside our region that see what's happened in the Ogallala, and they say, well, just, stop farming or don't grow. Can you speak briefly about the impact that irrigation has on the communities, and to just imagine what the communities, if we were all of a sudden to stop having irrigation, it's a big social issue too. It's not just production. For me at least, and we see it, it's a social issue.
Oh my gosh, it is a social issue. And it is every time we have seen a transition in agriculture, and every time we have seen a technological advance in agriculture, we've seen how jobs have changed. And every time we lose something like irrigation, that's going to even make that change greater. One thing in the last 10 years that I have seen and observed, and I find so interesting, for example, is cotton harvest. We have gone to, round bale modules, and that's fantastic at the farm level. You have now taken a job that took several people. You had someone, driving the bowl buggy. You had someone packing modules. You had someone, driving the stripper. You had people doing all sorts of things. And now really you can have one person out there in the middle of the night, and you can move those round bales the next day. And so every time something happens in ag, we see these technological advances, we do lose jobs in the community. But as we take irrigation out of the picture, we will see, and we have seen that, I believe, already in the southern portion of the Texas High Plains, where irrigation has probably declined the most, or I shouldn't say probably, it has declined the most rapidly. And as we move north, we gradually see that transition. And it's not just the impact at the farm level and the jobs at the farm, and people can no longer hire, their farm hands, and they no longer need as many people because they don't have the crop productivity. But there's the impact. People are no longer shopping within their community. They don't need or they're not buying the implements. They're not buying the soil moisture sensors. And that becomes a really important consideration. We talk about the value of sensors and how this can change agriculture. But if you are at a point where you only have a capacity to, say, apply 5 inches of water a year, do you really need to fully sensor that field? That's all you have. You're not going to say, oh, okay, I'm only going to apply 3.5 inches this year, or, you can't apply more. And so there's that impact. But then beyond the agriculture sector, well, now all of a sudden you have people who are leaving, you have fewer kids, you see schools close. We've already seen towns with hospital districts closing. We have towns where the main street and the town square used to be robust, and they are dead communities. And it is really tragic to see, these agricultural based communities that become ghost towns because there is no longer the productivity there. So as we easily say, the greater we and people who are making policy say, well, just stop farming. Well, fine and dandy, but when you take the farming out of these communities, you lose that economic foundation. Now, that's not to say that the livestock industry is not still going to serve a role, yes, because there's a significant economic component to the livestock industry, but the jobs are different. You know, if you take all this land and convert it to native rangeland, that's going to be a totally different structure. And even though we have, a very solid workforce within the fed, whether it's the beef cattle industry, the confined animal feeding industry, or say even the dairy industry, those are different structures. So,
and just the investment. So, and I like to share this with everybody. The investment we have on a per acre basis in intensive crop production. You have ag inputs, you have human labor inputs, and you have the output, that cash flow per acre that goes to the farm, that then goes to pay bills, it goes to all the other things. If we go to native range, it's really great for the sustainability of that soil and that environment, but just the economic value and input going into that per acre basis, it's significant. I expect we're going to see, especially with the new climate smart bills coming through, I expect to see a lot of our traditional dry land graze out winter wheat acres go into a more perennial forage, which will be interesting, probably as productive, but it does shift the management and the strategies. It's going to be quite interesting to see 15 years down the road.
It does. So because of that, you and I are along the same brainwave here. I recently started a project where we are looking at improved perennial forages. So I have a very water limited Bermuda grass that I've established. I'm actually doing some of this with Mark Marsalis at New Mexico State. And so as we look at and this is back to your first question, how do you manage this limited irrigated acreage? And do you take it out? Would an improved perennial forage be an option? So deficit irrigated Bermuda grass versus a Iron Master blue stem versus like an NRCS blend. And so looking at the productivity of those in comparison to an annual forage, and, is it going to, the economic value, but also the soil health benefits? But you mentioned climate, and I don't want to make this a confrontational discussion, but at some point, when do we step back? And in academia, we are quick to get on the grant bandwagon. But at some point, why is ag to blame? Why is the farmer taking the responsibility of the world's climate problems and having to be the
bearer? So, and maybe I'll finish. I mean, it's not only are they blamed, but they're basically taking the risk of adopting new things and adoption of new and it's a risk, and so they're made to take this risk or even economic loss, and it's deemed as they are supposed to take this economic loss.
Right. And so by biting this carrot, we have all these climate smart programs, and they are going to bite a carrot and maybe get $5, $10, $20 an acre for this carrot. But what is going to be the trickle down impact from that? And by biting that carrot, they are acknowledging that they had poor agricultural practices and that they are improving them in the name of climate smart agriculture. But when we step back and look at the big picture and look at the impact of flying, I'm just as guilty here. The impact of, and it's not, I'm not against fossil fuels, but plastics and not recycling. And I mean, for heaven's sakes, I just got back from the NFR at Vegas. You should see the lights. If you can imagine the carbon emissions associated with lighting up Vegas, and so
a desert that has how many water features?
Exactly.
In an evaporative environment where any surface water is gone like that. But exactly. That's another story.
Right. It is another story. But so I did not go to ASA, and I created this slide for a presentation that was shared on my behalf, and my collaborator, being the very politically savvy guy he is, took the slide out. But I was stating that I was doing my part for the environment by not going. And my round trip flight from Amarillo, Texas to St. Louis and back was equivalent to the CO2 emissions per EPA and the EPA website of like 4 dairy cows per year, or, a couple of hundred of West Texas farm acres per year, to offset all this. And so it's like, this is ridiculous. And we're putting the blame on agriculture, saying that agriculture, needs to change their practices, but we, as the general public, do not change our activities.
Jourdan, I'm trying to think of how to politely say this. I can't wait till you have full tenure and are full profit and really let loose. I know you're tenured, and honestly,
guess what? I can't get tenured in the A&M system. I'm off campus. So
okay, well, no.
I'm speaking in my own.
I should have looked at your stuff. The fun thing. So this is why I love this podcast. I get to visit with folks like you, and I don't think we addressed anything that you said we should address in your intro, but I think just conversations with you is so fun, and we're going to have you back.
It's time for our famous 3.
Be good on time, and the time on these. I'm going to wrap up. I already told you some of the questions. What resource, if you're thinking of things and a question comes up work-wise, what are some of your go-to resources?
I would say my fellow colleagues. I mean, it's amazing, and not just fellow colleagues within the A&M system, colleagues at OSU. I read your information. I read information out of Kansas State. We are truly all in this together. We are all really trying to produce valuable information to benefit producers in the Southern Great Plains. And collectively, there's great resources out there. So my go-to information really would be the information from my colleagues.
So in any free time, what do you do? Or do you have any leisurely activities, or what's your free time look like, Jourdan?
At this point in my life, my free time is pretty consumed by family and family activities. I don't have a lot of hobbies. I wish I could say I knit and quilt and do great things, but no, I work and have my kids, but that's great. I love them both.
So, finally, where do people go to find out more about your work and what's going on in your program?
Okay, so you can just Google Texas A&M Agrilife, Jourdan Bell, Amarillo, and you can find, we have a website where we do post our annual activities, or they can just reach out to me directly. That would be great too.
Well, Jourdan, thank you for your time, and everybody listening. If you like this video, if you enjoyed this podcast, take the time, share it. We're new, so get the word out about the Crop Science Podcast. Leave us a comment if you'd like to know more about this topic or any other. And also, if you have anybody you think we just have to have on as a guest, please let us know. Jourdan, again, thank you for your time. Have a wonderful, wonderful time with your family.
Thank you. You too.